What's a story that you've heard that still gives you chills to this day? Story 1. When I was in 11th grade, my math teacher went off on a tangent about everything happening for a reason and why it is always important to be kind. At first, I was only half listening, then things got interesting. When he was a senior in university, he decided that in his last days he would go around to students sitting alone in the cafeteria and strike up a conversation. He approached a girl sitting alone and asked if he could have lunch with her. She seemed hesitant at first, but then agreed. They struck up a conversation and ended up talking for a while. She eventually asked him, in a startled way, why he came and sat with her. He explained to her that it had become his goal to sit with people he didn't know. She told him that this wasn't the first time someone had randomly asked her to have lunch with them. Apparently, when she was in high school, she was very shy and unpopular and usually spent her lunch breaks in the library. Towards the end of the year, a group of popular girls asked her to have lunch with them. She was shocked and said no at first. They persisted, and she eventually agreed. They got in one of the girls' cars and drove off school property, headed to a restaurant. As they were driving down the road, dozens of cop cars rushed past them. She went to Columbine High School. It was April 20th, 1999. She escaped being in the library where most of the tragedy took place because a group of girls decided to reach out to her. Story 2. One day when he was young, about 10 to 12 maybe, he was playing outside near a small river with a friend. He lived in southern Wisconsin, so it was probably very cold. While playing, they noticed something strange in the water. It was a capsized canoe with two men who were probably fishing, hanging on for dear life in the freezing water. He says they had already turned sort of bluish and could barely talk. So the two kids got the men out of there and essentially saved their lives. It became a big thing in their town. There was even a story about it in the local paper and everything. Everyone was happy. Fast forward about 5 years. My dad was on his way to a concert in Chicago with one of his buddies, the same kid as above, in his new car. Of course, they were young and careless, and it was the 70s, so no one thought much about seatbelts. While driving past some bar, where there was a big party going on, a mobile home came flying out of the parking lot into the street. The driver obviously didn't look at all and was probably impaired. My dad crashed his car head-on into this trailer and totaled his car. The fact that they weren't wearing seatbelts ironically saved their lives. The bottom half of the car was crushed, but the crash propelled them forward and upward. Luckily, nothing happened to him or his friend. Not a scratch, only shock. Just as they got out of the car and tried to catch their breath, the propane tank on the trailer exploded and the whole thing caught on fire. Stumbling out of the trailer came two men covered in flames, screaming in pain, and they passed away right there in front of everyone. People from the bar had gathered around. It turned out these two men were the exact same fishermen he and his friend had saved 5 years ago. This is all true, by the way. I didn't believe him at first, but he showed me the articles in the paper, and his parents confirmed. Story 3. I forgot the title, but there's this creepypasta of a man who stays at a hotel with the one rule that he cannot look into the unmarked locked room on the way to his own room. He looks through the keyhole and sees a woman sitting in the corner. He thinks about knocking, but decides to leave her alone. The next morning, his curiosity gets to him again, and he looks through the keyhole. However, this time all he could see was a distinct red color. He assumed the woman knew he was spying on her and covered the keyhole with red cloth. He later went to the receptionist and asked about the room. The receptionist explained that a woman had once been harmed in that room, and many guests had reported seeing her ghost. She was pale all over, except for her eyes. They were red. Story 4. My grandmother's entire life, she had a recurring nightmare. In this nightmare, she would be walking down a long, dark hallway, turn to the left, open a door, and see something terrible. She would always wake up before seeing what it was. In her 40s, she, her husband, my dad, and my aunt were on vacation. They booked the hotel at the last minute, so they ended up having to get 2 rooms with 2 twin beds on opposite sides of the floor. My dad woke up around 3 a.m. and could immediately tell something wasn't right. He called out in the darkness, "Dad?" No response. He turned on the bedside light. "Dad?" he said, a little louder this time. Still no response. Getting worried, he slid out of bed and shook his father. He didn't wake up. My dad ran down the hotel hallway to my grandma's room and started banging on the door. My grandma worriedly opened the door and my dad shouted, "Something's wrong with Dad." He led her down the hallway, a long hallway, to the last door on the left. My grandmother reached the door, turned to the left, and saw her husband lifeless in bed. Heart attack. She never had the dream again. Story 5. My great-grandparents grew up in a small town located in the lower regions of Louisiana. Raised on a healthy diet of squirrel stew and local folktales, my grandparents were the Cajun stereotype. When my great-grandparents were first married, they lived in a small house near a cane field. Across the field, there was a Catholic church, which served most of the humble bayou town. My great-grandparents made it a habit to attend church during daylight hours, as it was a long walk to and from church, unless they walked through the cane. Well, one night, for one reason or another, they decided to attend evening mass. They walked to church as the sun was shifting down below the visible earth. When they exited the building, it was pitch black. Fatigued from a long day of work, my grandparents decided to walk through the cane and avoid the long path. The crickets chirped as my grandparents crunched their way through the cane, one right behind the other. They could barely see through the dim moonlight, leaving them to rely on sound and touch. Working their way through the cane was tiring, and my grandfather stopped to catch his breath. My grandmother bumped into him, and they both froze. Another set of footsteps had joined theirs. They stood frozen in place, hearing the heavy thud of feet crunch against the cane. My grandfather began to slowly walk, my grandmother by his side. They were afraid to anger the visitor. My grandmother noted its odd walking pattern. Immediately, fear ran through her. She began to run, and then the footsteps behind them grew fast-paced. My grandfather took off after her, not wanting to be caught by the visitor. After about 5 minutes of sprinting, they reached the end of the cane field, their house in sight. They quickly raced to the door, fumbling to unlock it. A shadow emerged from the cane field, walking on 4 legs. It began to run at them as they managed to unlock the door. As they opened it, their dog ran inside. Their dog, Kaiser, trembled as they locked the door once more. Kaiser was usually a fearless animal and often accompanied my grandfather on his hunting trips. His bravery was gone as the door began to shake. Something was banging and scratching on the door. My grandfather assumed it was some animal. Then the doorknob began to jiggle. Somebody was turning it from the outside. Eventually it stopped. Shuffling could still be heard outside the door. My grandfather grabbed his rifle and stood guard all night as my grandmother slept. When the sun began to rise, the noises outside ceased. When they opened the door, it was covered in large scratch marks. To her death, my grandmother claimed that she was chased by the Rougarou, Cajun werewolf. Story 6. A 16-year-old girl is house-sitting for a family friend. Late one night when she is all alone, she hears a weird noise coming from the basement. The noise won't stop, but because she is by herself, she decides not to go down into the basement as fear begins to creep into her mind. She calls 911 and explains her story and tells them not to rush as it is probably nothing. Within 2 minutes, several cops are at the door. 4 cops make their way down into the basement and 1 stays with the girl outside. She hears yelling, and moments later, a disturbed-looking man is brought up by the police. He was found sitting on the washer, hitting a large knife between the washer and dryer, trying to lure her down. She asked how they knew he was down there, and they said when she called the police and hung up the phone, the operator heard a second click. He was listening. Story 7. When Chinese flag bearer and basketball phenom Yao Ming walked through the national stadium during the opening ceremony of the Olympics, there was so much commotion where I was that I neglected to find out more about the little boy he was walking with. It was Lin Hao, a 9-year-old who survived the deadly earthquake in Sichuan in May. It's interesting how this tribute to the earthquake by opening ceremony director Zhang Yimou has been covered by the international press. Many Western news outlets reported that Lin was an earthquake survivor, but they failed to mention that the little boy, who was attending the Uzixi Primary School in quake epicenter Wenchuan County, not only survived, but after getting out of his classroom, went back into the rubble to pull 2 classmates out to safety. During his rescue, he was hit by falling debris and suffered injuries on his head and arms. It's also been reported that while his classmates, 10 survivors out of 32 students, were waiting for help, he encouraged them to sing songs to keep their spirits up. When he was asked why he risked his life, he said, "I was the hall monitor, It was my job to look after my classmates. Story 8. My Oma, grandmother in German, grew up in a small town called Wieslach, Germany, during the Holocaust and World War II. She rarely talks about that period of her life, but when we ask, she would say things like, "Yeah, I had friends who just disappeared, but we were raised not to ask questions." However, the most haunting story I heard was when she told me she was playing by a railroad track near her home with some friends. At one point, a large freight train came by. She heard what she thought to be scratching and cries, but not those of an animal because she had heard that many times before when the train had passed. This time it was different. So she ran home and asked her mom what that could have been or meant. She said that her mom just yelled at her to never ask questions like that again and to stay away from the tracks and talk to no one. Story 9. This is probably going to get buried, but another user mentioned Carla Homolka, and I remembered a story about my mom. In her early 20s, my mom managed a photography studio in a mall in Scarborough, Ontario. One day my mom was working alone, and this guy came in asking for a photo, but he was being a little weird about it, saying he needed a picture taken of his hip. They did a lot of injury photos for court cases, so my mom assumed this was what he needed and started loading up the camera. When she looked up, he had removed his pants and was exposing himself. My mom started laughing nervously and told him to get out. She didn't have time for this nonsense. About an hour later, a girl who was working at the denim store down the hall came down to tell her about this same man who had done the same thing in the middle of the store, trying to expose himself to the female customers. They both had a laugh. He didn't seem all that menacing, just clearly not all there. 2 days later, the girl came running into my mom's studio, pale as a ghost. On the front page of the paper was a sketch of the guy with the title, Scarborough Rapist. It's pretty chilling to think that she was that close to being harmed by Paul Bernardo at the peak of his crime spree. Story 10. About 15 years ago, I was 17 and in high school in Seattle. I hung out a lot with people who smoked or drank, but didn't really join in too often. My parents were okay with it, but basically made me realize I didn't need it. That didn't mean I didn't participate occasionally. One night, I was with a few friends from our soccer team. They wanted to smoke before we all had to go home since it was a school night. We went to Volunteer Park on Capitol Hill. There are a lot of trees on the west side of the road there, where you can go do things people don't want to be seen doing. Everything was normal, giggling, excited kids smoking some weed. No big deal. I took a hit off the blunt, but because my parents were picking me up, I decided to go cop watch. I just wanted to hit it once, go home and play some video games, but still be cool, no big deal. I told them I was going to go out and make sure no cops came. They might have paid attention or they might not have. Normal stuff, no big deal. At the park, there are these evergreen trees that have really low-hanging branches that make it really easy to get 20+ feet up in them. Imagine a really fat, reasonable-sized Christmas tree, but without all the branches blocking the view. I climbed up one of those and relaxed and looked at the Space Needle. What a great night. Then I heard some branches snapping below me, and I saw a guy standing there. He was staring where my friends were. I looked past him about 25 feet, and there was another guy standing there, and a few more. I looked to my other side, and there were more guys standing there, about 15 total in a semicircle around where I thought my friends were. This was about 11 p.m., no reason for a group of them there. I didn't move. This wasn't some community cop stuff, or even cops. I waited for what seemed like forever, slowly climbed down, and dropped and sprinted as fast as I could towards the greenhouse. About 50 feet away, I saw my friends running out of the woods back where I thought they were. They said someone tried to grab one of them on the way out. The girl screamed as the guy grabbed my friend and they all ran. No reason. So sketchy. I've heard about people disappearing from Seattle parks before. Forget that. Be careful, high schoolers in Seattle just trying to have some fun. Story 11. When I was maybe 4 and my sister was almost 1, my parents had been divorced a few months and my mother was driving us from Las Vegas to Wichita to see our grandparents. At one gas station on the way, this man came up to the car and told my mother, "I hate to see a single mother traveling alone, and I notice we are headed in the same direction. Do you want me to follow you for a while to make sure you are safe?" She politely said no thanks and drove off. At our next stop for gas, he again came up under the guise of checking on us. He had been following us since the last stop. While he was talking to my mother, his sport coat blew open, and I saw a gun tucked in his pants. After she again told the man we were fine, she left and I told her what I saw. While she was driving, she wrote a note to give to the next gas station attendant, saying who we were, where we were planning on spending the night, and that this creepy dude was following us and what he looked like. Could you please call the police in, I don't remember what town it was, and have them waiting at the hotel? When we got to the next stop, Mom raced in and handed the clerk the note and sped off with us. We got to the hotel and the manager had the cops waiting in one room and gave us another room with a pizza and pop. The man showed up and asked if his wife and kids had checked in yet and what room they were in. The manager gave him the key to the one with the police in it. They questioned him and found out he was a convicted criminal and also had a warrant out, so he was arrested. Story 12. I hope this doesn't get buried. I'm writing on a mobile device, forgive my mistakes. My friend Jacob told me this about a month ago. Backstory for a little bit of context. Jacob's mother is a drug addict, and his father really didn't have much wrong with him outside of being with his mother. One night when Jacob and his father were asleep, they slept in the same room, they heard a series of loud banging, scratching, and moving noises come from the mother's room. Jacob's father jumped out of bed and ran down the hall and started slamming on the door. His mother opened it, yelling at him to quiet down, and that he woke her up. He asked her about the sounds. She hadn't been awake to hear them. Jacob's dad would have assumed that she was on something again, but something was wrong. The window was open all the way, and the TV was moved across the room, still plugged in, and had the screen facing outside. Jacob's dad was reasonably scared. He shut the window, got his bat, locked the mother's room from the outside, and made her sleep in the living room. He stayed up most of the night. He woke up Jacob at 5. It was still dark out. Jacob went out to the kitchen where his mother already was. He ate cereal. A couple minutes later, his dad walked in, wide-eyed. He pointed at Jacob and his mother and held his finger to his lips. They both quieted down. They heard something shuffling around on the roof, going from edge to edge. Jacob's dad had the bat. They sat together in the room, quiet. Minutes later, the sound went away. Jacob's grandmother was called. She was asked if everybody could stay over there for a little while. She said yes and told them she'd come pick them up. Jacob finished eating and went to go sit on the couch. There was no TV in that room, so he sat in silence. He looked over at a door to an empty room in the hallway. The door was open. There was a finger wrapped around the side of it. Jacob screamed and pointed to it, and his dad grabbed him and ran out. Jacob's mother followed behind. They went to a gas station and sat out front until they saw Jacob's grandmother's truck. Jacob described how unnatural the finger looked to me. He said it reminded him a little bit of a foam finger, in length and width. It was wrapped clear around the door frame, the door itself being latched onto the opposite side. They didn't go back to that house much after that. Once they'd gotten everything out of it, they never went back again. Nothing was stolen, and the window in the empty room was open. Story 13. I work as a nurse. While I was training to become a nurse, a group of my friends and I were having a discussion as to whether there is some sort of an afterlife. I stated that I didn't think so, and a few of my friends disagreed. My instructor looked at me and said, "Well, I used to be like you, but I have seen some strange things in the hospital that made me change my mind." She proceeded to tell us a story about a friend of hers, who was a nurse, whose daughter had terminal cancer. The daughter was in her late 20s, early 30s. She had a husband and 2 small children. This was a devastating situation, and she was about to pass any day. She knew this and kept telling her friends and family how afraid she was of dying. Even though she would be surrounded by her family in her last hours, she knew that she would die alone. Her parents were taking turns spending the night with her in the hospital room along with her husband. It was her father's turn to go home for the evening and take care of the grandkids. She ended up dying that night, and her last words were, "I'm not afraid anymore." Dad is here with me. As nurses and other health professionals can attest, people have some strange last words that may or may not mean anything. After the body had been processed and taken to the morgue, the mother went home and found her husband dead on the couch. She anticipated having 1 funeral, and she now had to plan for 2. It was really unsettling. Also, there is a ghost in my hospital of a 10-year-old little girl who was the first child to die in my hospital. Many patients report seeing her in a white hospital gown. Several patients have been noted to yell, "Get that little girl out of here." Story 14. I was 16, 17, and it was very common for my friends and I to go camping in the mountains, bring weed, beer, acid, whatever. I was always a big fraidy cat when it came to getting messed up, so I usually abstained. Parents' warnings taken to heart, I guess. This particular night, most of my friends were tripping acid, while I was sipping a beer, enjoying the fire and whatnot, and a bunch of us girls decided to go off somewhere to pee. We were still pretty young and quite squeamish about the boys seeing us squat. Hell, I still am. We stumble off into the woods and end up walking for quite some time. One girl was searching for the perfect spot, and she was super high, but we all just went along. We finally come to a small clearing and decide to pee there. Everyone pees and we set off back to camp. One of my friends hears a low moan coming from the other side of the clearing, tells us to shh, but we don't hear it, so we urge her to come on. She is intent on investigating, so I decide to go with her. It was really dark out. You could only see as far as the lantern's light hit, so we were off into the unknown. Our light finally revealed a car, a brand new looking Subaru. It was really sudden-like, and kind of freaked us out, so we scamper back to our friends, screeching like little 16, 17-year-old girls, and set off back to our camp, all freaked out. We tell the boys about it when we get there, and they convince us we had happened upon another campsite and make fun of us for freaking out. 5 years later, I am in nursing school and working as an admin assistant in a labor and delivery hospital. I have made a really good friend at work, and she and I hang out all the time. One night she comes over and we are drinking, and she tells me her dad has been missing since she was in high school. She says he had tried to end his life a few times and her family figured that he succeeded, but no one ever found him. She secretly was hoping he just ran off to start a new life, and maybe she would see him again someday. Not very long after that, a man was found in a stolen Subaru up on the mountain where we used to camp. He had been there for years, through every season, freezing to hot. There was a hose from the tailpipe to the window. The man had taken his life. It made the news, and one of the guys from high school called and reminded me of that night in the woods. The car was found not far from our usual spot. Wasn't that nuts? That was what we saw. At work, my friend got a call from her mother. The guy in the car was her dad. We heard him moaning. We saw the car. If we weren't such clueless little kids, we could have done something. I watched my friend fall apart over it, but didn't tell her about my experience in the woods. I have always felt so bad. Story 15. This is the story of how I came to believe in ghosts. When I was 12, my mom dragged me and my friend along with her to a haircut. We were bored and decided to take a walk down the main street we were on and window shop. Just a few stores down there was a gap for a small parking lot. As we walk past, an elderly African-American lady waves us over to the car she's sitting in, with the door open. Being that there are the two of us, and that she's clearly more feeble, we go inquire what's wrong. The lady seems a little out of it and is begging us to go across the street to another salon that her daughter owns. She's having trouble getting out of the car, see, and wants her daughter's help. She just keeps repeating, even as we're walking away to begin the task, multiple renditions of, "Please just get my daughter, and I'm stuck in the car." We walk over and inquire to the salon. Two small, very pale girls wandering into a primarily African-American hair studio, and are greeted with odd looks and silence. We get shown to the manager. She listens to our story and goes from inquisitive to white as a sheet in all of 10 seconds. We look to one another as something is obviously wrong. She starts in on us, asking all these questions, starting to grow upset. When we inquire what we did wrong and why we're not going to help her mom, she tells us this. With a nauseous look and tears starting down her face, she says her mother just a few months before had died horribly when she was forced off a bridge and drowned when she couldn't get herself out of her car. We immediately run back across the street. No car, no lady. Ask the lot attendant. No older lady fitting that description had come through all shift. I never could question again. We thought it was a prank, but the daughter's reaction was too real and candid to be anything but the truth. Story 16. When I was a Boy Scout, I got the filmmaking merit badge while at winter camp one year. In order to earn it, you have to complete a short film, no matter how terrible. It's luck of the draw, naturally, when it comes to who is in your merit badge class, But since we were all in the woods, we decided a slasher flick would be a lot of fun. We wrote a script where a masked killer goes around stabbing people at a Boy Scout camp. We weren't, creative geniuses or anything. There was a kid named Paul in the group who was pretty cool, got along great with everyone. He was one of those guys who was just naturally likable, but we unanimously voted to make him play the killer because he had this really creepy Peter Lorre eye thing going on. He did great, fake stabbing a bunch of victims and being menacing enough for a movie produced by 12 and 13-year-olds. We edited the thing, buckets of fake blood, bad acting and all, and I forgot about it completely until 6 years later when I was a freshman at college and recognized Paul walking between buildings. I jogged over. We made small talk about each other's spring break plans, since it was a week away. And that was that. Not like we'd kept in touch or anything. Fast forward a week, and I'm back home watching the news when I see a report about a young man who killed his mother, father, and 2 family dogs, and then lit their house on fire over the break. The police already had a suspect in custody, so the newscast flashed his picture, and sure enough, it was Paul. You can guess how he did it. He stabbed them to death. Story 17. This isn't a story I heard, but one that I experienced myself. I was 7 years old, and we, my mom and sister, moved into our new house in Florida. My father had died the year before from complications during a triple bypass. My sister and I slept upstairs. In between our rooms was a pretty open area loft. One night I woke up sometime really late, and for some reason I got up and looked across the loft towards my sister's room, and clear as day, I saw a shadow in the shape of a man standing at the edge of the stairs. The house was pitch black. There were no lights to cast a shadow. Being 7 years old, I freaked out thinking it was a burglar and jumped back in bed and cried myself to sleep. I woke up a short period of time later, maybe 15 to 30 minutes. I got up and checked the stairs again, and the shadow was gone. So I grabbed my little Tyke's flashlight and headed downstairs towards my mom's room. Her door was cracked a little bit, so I peeked through, and I saw a shadow figure walk around my mother's bed, then bend over her. I shined my light on the floor in front of her door, and the figure juts to an upright position, seems to look at me, then turns and walks into her bathroom. I'm an atheist, and I'm not sure if I believe in spirits, but to this day I have no explanation for what happened, other than it being my father checking up on us, and then bending over to kiss my mom goodbye. Perhaps one last time. Just recalling and typing this out sends shivers down my spine. Story 18. This may get buried, but for the brave souls sorting by new, a friend of mine lived on Long Island about in 2001. I want to say Brentwood. Anyways, it doesn't matter. I lived in California back then. Still do. I knew one woman who died on September 11th, a flight attendant on the plane that crashed in Pennsylvania. But that was it. And I only barely knew her. I figured, as a New Yorker, almost, my friend probably knew more folks, or at least had a story about September 11th. I guess I had asked out of a sort of morbid fascination. September 11th always seemed like a movie. Even when it was happening, in my mind it was happening on CNN, not in a real place where people lived. So when I asked, I suppose I was hoping for a story of collapsing buildings, running and panicking, and I could say, oh my God, that sounds horrible. But secretly think, it would be so cool to have been on the ground that day. How exciting. What she said wasn't exciting at all. She told me she didn't know anybody personally who had died that day and that she hadn't been in Manhattan, and so on and so on. But what she did say is she went to the train station every day very early for work, far earlier than most people do, and she noticed that before September 11th, there had almost never been any cars in the lot when she arrived, but afterwards there were always 6 or 7 cars. The same cars, they never moved. And every day they got more and more tickets and chalk marks on the tires, until eventually the meter maids figured out who these cars belonged to and realized they would never return for them. Somehow this story of hers got to me more than any of the footage or the images of people jumping or any of that did. It all seemed so exciting and unreal on the TV. And then here was a story without any excitement, without any screams or running or collapsing buildings or tales of heroism. Just a few cars sitting in a parking lot as silent testimonies to people who would never drive them again because they had been murdered. Suddenly it didn't seem so exciting anymore. Story 19. When my uncle was 4, he visited his aunt's home for the summer. There were really no kids around that were his age, so he mainly just rode his bike around the neighborhood to amuse himself. One day he rode a little too far and got lost, but luckily a car pulled over and told him that it was okay. He would take him back to his aunt's house. So my uncle loaded his bike in the car and got in. The man started to drive, and my uncle, thinking it was one of his aunt's friends, asked no questions. It wasn't until they turned onto the highway that my uncle started to ask the man where they were going, that his aunt's house wasn't near the highway. The man didn't say anything to him and kept driving until suddenly he pulled over to the side of the road and seemed to think really hard on something. He then turned the car around and dropped my uncle off at the entrance to the neighborhood. My uncle realized years later that this man had attempted to kidnap him and at the last minute changed his mind. Story 20. 2 years ago, in 6 days, I was in a car wreck and almost died. I was driving home late at night, fell asleep at the wheel, and slammed into a tree on my driver's side front door. I have no memory of what happened for the next couple of days, but I woke up in the ICU, strapped to a bed with a respirator and feeding tube in me. I had broken bones in my skull, my collarbone, collapsed both lungs, and ruptured my diaphragm. Every doctor I have seen since then looks at me in shock and tells me I shouldn't be here. The chilling part of the story is how I was found. Some neighbors of mine were driving home late from dropping their daughter off at a bus that she was taking to camp, where she was a counselor. The bus left late. It was delayed because another couple counselors were an hour and a half late. One of them was my best friend from elementary school. After they finally dropped their daughter off, they headed home and were driving down a secluded road near our neighborhood. The wife saw a car parked on the wrong side of the road, but couldn't tell that there was any damage because it was dark and on the opposite side of the car. They kept driving until she thought she heard honking and convinced her husband to turn around. I was unconscious. The car was dead, and the horn was found to not be working later. They didn't know it was me until 2 days later. They saved my life. Story 21. My favorite creepypasta, quite long but worth it. In 1983, a team of deeply pious scientists conducted a radical experiment in an undisclosed facility. The scientists had theorized that a human without access to any senses or ways to perceive stimuli would be able to perceive the presence of God. They believed that the 5 senses clouded our awareness of eternity, and without them, a human could actually establish contact with God by thought. An elderly man who claimed to have nothing left to live for was the only test subject to volunteer. To purge him of all his senses, the scientists performed a complex operation in which every sensory nerve connection to the brain was surgically severed. Although the test subject retained full muscular function, he could not see, hear, taste, smell, or feel. With no possible way to communicate with or even sense the outside world, he was alone with his thoughts. Scientists monitored him as he spoke aloud about his state of mind in jumbled, slurred sentences that he couldn't even hear. After 4 days, the man claimed to be hearing hushed, unintelligible voices in his head. Assuming it was an onset of psychosis, the scientists paid little attention to the man's concerns. 2 days later, the man cried that he could hear his dead wife speaking with him, and even more, he could communicate back. The scientists were intrigued, but were not convinced until the subject started naming dead relatives of the scientists. He repeated personal information to the scientists that only their dead spouses and parents would have known. At this point, a sizable portion of scientists left the study. After a week of conversing with the deceased through his thoughts, the subject became distressed, saying the voices were overwhelming. In every waking moment, his consciousness was bombarded by hundreds of voices that refused to leave him alone. He frequently threw himself against the wall, trying to elicit a pain response. He begged the scientists for sedatives so he could escape the voices by sleeping. This tactic worked for 3 days until he started having severe night terrors. The subject repeatedly said that he could see and hear the deceased in his dreams. Only a day later, the subject began to scream and claw at his non-functional eyes, hoping to sense something in the physical world. The hysterical subject now said the voices of the dead were deafening and hostile, speaking of hell and the end of the world. At one point, he yelled, "No heaven, no forgiveness," for 5 hours straight. He continually begged to be killed, but the scientists were convinced that he was close to establishing contact with God. After another day, the subject could no longer form coherent sentences. Seemingly mad, he started to bite at his own flesh. The scientist rushed into the test chamber and restrained him to a table so he could not hurt himself further. After a few hours of being tied down, the subject halted his struggling and screaming. He stared blankly at the ceiling as teardrops silently streaked across his face. For 2 weeks, the subject had to be manually rehydrated due to the constant crying. Eventually, he turned his head and, despite his blindness, made focused eye contact with a scientist for the first time in the study. He whispered, "I have spoken with God, and he has abandoned us," and his vital signs stopped. There was no apparent cause of death. Story 22. This is a completely true story. I didn't exaggerate or add any details. This happened several years ago, when I was 19. It was sometime during the summer, probably in June. I was staying with my best friend. She lived with her grandparents. And at about 11 p.m., we decided we would drive down to see some friends in Tulsa, which is about 4 hours away from where we are in KC. Never mind the fact that we would be arriving around 3 a.m. It was the weekend, so no doubt our friends would be up partying at that time. So we got some snacks and hit the road. Now we had driven to Tulsa many times over the years, but the only route we knew was Route 69, which is this little 2-lane highway. We would have preferred to take the interstate since it was nighttime. We'd only ever made the drive during the day, but we couldn't find a map. Her grandparents didn't have internet access, and this was just before the days of GPS, so we had to take the route we knew. Route 69 between Kansas City and Tulsa basically goes through the middle of nowhere. The entire drive you're passing through cornfields or the woods. There are no lights but your headlights at night, and no cell phone service the entire way. At least this is how it was then. I haven't driven that road since that night. Basically, we were banking on a smooth journey the whole way, or we'd be totally done for. We had no idea when we left just how badly things could potentially turn out. We were having a great time, listening to the radio, eating our snacks, windows down. We were about halfway there when things started to get weird. Remember, this is a 4-hour trip, so we were 2 hours into the middle of nowhere with no cell service, and we were approaching the point of no return. We had just enough gas to either get us there or back home, so we had to either go the whole way or turn around. At this point, there were also woods on either side of us, starting just a few yards from the road on each side. Then the weirdness began. We noticed some blood on the road in the other lane. No big deal. We figured someone must have hit a deer, which is very common in that area. But as we kept driving, there was more blood, and more blood, and more blood. Over the course of 10 miles or so, the amount of blood on the road grew from a small splattering to a massive pool, covering about 3 car lengths, still in the other lane, running off into the woods. This is when we start to realize that something isn't right. Not only was it an extremely large amount of blood, more than there could ever possibly be just from hitting a deer, but that's all there was, just blood. There were no animal parts of any kind, not even random chunks of fur, no broken glass or other car wreckage, nothing. Just a massive amount of blood on the road. We also realized that we hadn't passed a single other car the entire time. And considering that the blood was on the other side of the road, if someone had hit an animal and their car was still drivable, it would have passed us a while back. Not only that, but the blood was very, very fresh. Whatever had happened within the last couple of hours at the most. Naturally, we were starting to freak out. Neither one of us is the type to panic or assume the worst, but we had seen a lot of horror movies, and I'm sure that you all are aware of how a lot of horror movies start. Something just felt really, really off too. Even before we realized there was something beyond roadkill happening, we both got a gut feeling that something was very wrong. Anyway, like I said before, we had pretty much reached the point of no return. We had to decide whether to turn around and go home or keep driving, and we had to decide quickly. Well, that decision was made for us. Suddenly, we arrived at a roadblock. I literally had to slam on my brakes to avoid hitting it. Things felt even weirder. For one thing, there were no previous signs warning that the road was going to be closed. Second, they barely looked authentic. They were old, the white and orange striped sawhorse kind, and the wood was rotting. You could hardly make out the letters in the words "road closed," And finally, there wasn't any sort of detour. Or so we thought. After sitting there for a minute, trying to make any sense of what was going on, nearing a state of panic, we realized that there was a detour. Off to the side of the road, there was a small, homemade, crooked-edge sign with the word detour. Yes, spelled that way, painted on it, in dripping red letters. Seriously, see what I mean about cheesy details? I would have come up with something better had I made this up, but that's just what happened. The sign pointed to a narrow, overgrown, obviously rarely used dirt road that led off into the pitch-black woods, and as far as we could see, it led away from the direction of the highway. This was when we decided, obviously, that we were getting out of there. And I don't know what possessed us to do this, but we decided to switch drivers. We both got out of the car and ran to switch, and as we got back into the car, the windows were still down, we definitely heard some voices and movement in the woods, very close to the edge, on both sides of the road. My friend was now driving, and she took off as fast as my crappy little car could go. We didn't look back. We just kept driving until we were back to civilization. To this day, we have no idea what really happened in the woods that night. When we got back to her grandparents' house, we just snuck in and eventually went to sleep. Thank God whoever or whatever was out there wasn't a little better at whatever they were doing. Road spikes to puncture tires. Anyone. They must have been new at the whole psycho game. Because I really feel like we very, very narrowly escaped something terrible out there. Story 23. I know I'm late to the party, but here goes. I took genocide as a class in my senior year of high school. We were lucky enough at the end to have a bunch of Holocaust survivors come and speak to us. One story stood out in particular. A man told us of how his life was saved by another prisoner. He was rifling through some garbage to try and find something edible when a guard caught him. The guard forced him to kneel, and he remembers the cold feeling of the guard's pistol poking the back of his neck. All of a sudden, a thick fog rolled in out of nowhere. The guard was distracted for a moment, and then the man heard a loud clang and rapid footsteps. The fog cleared as quickly as it came, and the man saw a bloody shovel on the ground, while another prisoner was running away at full speed. He then told us how he is broken and will never be whole until he sees the man again and thanks him. Fast forward 3 stories. A man comes in and tells about a night where he went to rummage through some garbage to find something edible. He sees another man doing the same in the distance, and then sees him being found out by a guard and almost executed. He was afraid, but when a thick fog rolled in, he saw a shovel near him and knew it was his only chance. He hit the guard on the head and ran back to his bunk without any spoils to hide. He then laments how he never saw the man again. Needless to say, we all freaked out and started screaming that the man he saved spoke only 30 minutes ago. The 2 men were brought together after nearly 70 years and broke down crying while sharing a long embrace. Turns out they had been living only 4 miles from each other for the past 40 years. Story 24. This is a true story. I witnessed it firsthand, and I am probably the most logic-driven, needs solid proof, skeptical type of guy you'll meet. My mother always claimed that her dreams had meanings. She is about 62 and grew up in Syria, which had more than its share of myths and stories like that. And being the skeptic I am, never took her claims seriously and always replied with for every dream that somewhat comes true, there are probably hundreds that don't, which human nature makes us conveniently forget. Anyway, when I was about 15, some 10 years ago, one morning just before midday, my mother came into the kitchen and was visibly shaken. She started to cry, and we asked her what was wrong. She said she had a bad dream about her elderly mother, who lived in Syria, and we live in Australia. She had never actually cried about a dream before, and while she claimed her dreams had meanings, she kind of went about it lightheartedly, and it didn't really affect her emotionally at all. So we kind of laughed it off and said, "Oh, is that all? We thought something actually happened. What was the dream?" She said she dreamed that her mother was holding her head with her hands like she was hurt. That's all the dream was, simply my grandmother holding her head in her hands as if in some kind of pain. So anyway, we decided to call up overseas a bit later that afternoon and see if everything was okay, as my mother continued to feel upset and worried. We knew that Grandma would be fine. We just wanted our mother to hear her voice so she would stop being sad and worried. So we call, and my uncle who lives with my grandma answers, and as expected, it turns out Grandma's fine. But he said that morning she had kind of tripped and bumped her face and eye on a cupboard, and she was a bit bruised, but otherwise she was absolutely fine. As you can imagine, we were quite surprised by this, as my mom's dream kind of had some meaning after all, and it was pretty accurate. So mom speaks to grandma about all sorts of things, sees how she is, gossips, etc., and says she loves her and all that, and gets off the phone. So afterwards, my mom is still sad and continues to be worried, as if something is very wrong. We thought she would be fine after speaking to her mom and seeing that she is fine. But for some reason, my mom starts crying again, this time even worse. We reassure her and tell her it's fine. We all just spoke to grandma and saw that she's fine, so stop worrying, etc. She is silent the whole time and just weeping. Few hours go by, mom kind of stays in her room weeping alone. Later that evening, the phone rings. My dad answers. It's my uncle. My grandma had just passed away from a stroke, literally a few minutes ago. We go in all together to my mother's room. She looks at us, still weeping, and simply shakes her head and says she already knows. We all hug her. I would never have believed it if I wasn't there the entire time. Story 25. I remember a story about a girl whose family had just moved to a new neighborhood. I believe she was 17 at the time. She was a really shy and mild-mannered girl and had a hard time making new friends at her new school. One day, a boy that she liked invited her over to his place for a party while his parents were off on a trip. She was just super excited to finally be included in something social. It'd be a good way to make friends. She told her parents she'd be having a sleepover with her friend Alexis, a lie, of course. They said that a sleepover would be fine as long as it was clean and she came home the next day. And absolutely no alcohol or drugs. Her family was the religious type. So when she gets to the guy's house Friday night, some friends are already there smoking weed and taking shots. They insist that she take some shots and join in the fun. After just a few drinks, she's already tipsy. Her guy friend's older brother, who is 22, says he needs to go out to get some more drinks and she decides to join. Bad decision. They get out onto the main avenue playing loud music and driving recklessly. It makes her nervous, but she's too afraid to say anything about it. Before anyone could realize it, the car had swerved into the other lane and ran straight into another car at full speed. The occupants in the other car were killed, and in her car, the two people in front were killed. She and another girl were mortally wounded. The girl ended in the hospital and was in life-threatening condition. She asked the doctor to do her a favor, to tell her parents that she was so sorry for disobeying them and that she loved them very much. The doctor nodded and smiled. Later that night, she silently passed away. The next day, one of the nurses asked the doctor if she told the girl's parents what she said before she died. The doctor said no. The nurse became livid. Well, if you don't tell them, then I will. You can't, said the doctor. Her parents died upon impact. Story 26. This will probably get buried, but I hope it doesn't. It really is a great story. Before my parents had my brother and I about 35 years ago, plus they would give Christmas to a family in need. Anyways, one year my mom picked a family who lost their mother, so a single dad and his two daughters. She bought them matching pajamas as well as a doll who had the same pajamas on. Anyways, fast forward to New Year's Eve the same year, my dad was on duty, he was a firefighter, at an apartment in our town. All the residents of the apartment were outside due to a small fire in one of the apartments. My dad was suddenly stopped by these two girls wearing those pajamas that my mother had picked out, also holding those dolls. The girls were standing with their father, no mother figure in sight. My dad had no choice but to stop and talk to them, and they went on and on about how Santa had given them the best Christmas ever. My dad held back tears and later found out it was their stove that caused the fire. To this day, my parents still give to a family in need every year. Story 27. The summer before my sophomore year in college, I had surgery on both legs, and the recovery took way longer than expected. It got to the point where I had to withdraw from school in order to fully recover, so I went home for the rest of the year. Anyway, after about 4 months at home, and my legs working, I figured I'd get a job and make some money. So I applied and got a job waiting at a popular chain restaurant. I quickly became friends with two of my fellow servers, Oscar and Louie. Oscar was a really friendly Hispanic guy, and Louie was this kid from New York with the typical cocky attitude. Anyway, fast forward another couple months, and we all head to Oscar's house to watch one of the NBA playoff games. He lives with his parents, so we make sure to introduce ourselves to them and thank them for letting us hang out there. Neither of his parents knew who we were, so we introduced ourselves. Both his mom and dad were really kind and welcomed me as I introduced myself. But when Louis introduced himself, Oscar's mom had an uneasy look on her face and asked to talk to Oscar in private. We're watching the game when Oscar comes back, and we ask what that was about, and he says not to worry about it, so we brush it off and just continue watching the game. It ends up going into overtime, but Louis can't stay for some reason or another, so he heads out, and I end up staying and watching the game with Oscar. After Louis leaves, Oscar tells me why his mom pulled him aside earlier. Apparently, she had a nightmare the night before, and in the dream, Oscar had met somebody named Luis, and nothing good came out of it. She warned him to be careful around Louis, as she didn't trust him. We kind of laughed it off, but it still hung in the back of our minds. A couple weeks later, I get a call from a female coworker of mine, crying, asking me to meet her at another mutual friend's place, so I hop in my car and head over. I meet her and Oscar at this guy's house, and she told us Louis had assaulted her the night before. Oscar and I looked at each other, but said nothing. It could have been a coincidence, but I still get chills thinking about it, and how Oscar's mom warned him that Louis would be trouble. Story 28. An AMC crew member named George was sent up in the spring with a two-way radio to assess the winter damage and report back to the crew below any special equipment that might be needed for opening the Lakes of the Clouds hut on Mount Washington. As in every winter, with the north winds blowing so fiercely, the windows of the hut are boarded up tight and secure. This was just how George found them that day. By the afternoon, the men at the base signaled up to the lone hiker to see that he had made a safe arrival. Strangely, he did not answer. This didn't worry the other members of the crew at first. Maybe he had gone out for a little hike around to check on some other things. By 8 o'clock that evening, the crew tried again, and still there was no radio response from George. Anxiety rose, and the members at the base drew out a plan for an early morning exodus to the hut to check on their friend's safety. The next morning, they made their way, slow and steady, up the snow-packed trail to the hut. From all indications, George had arrived safely at the hut. His backpack and gear lay open on the dining room floor. There on a table was his two-way radio, still powered. They called out for him but couldn't find him anywhere. The searchers began looking outside for footprints. They looked in the bunk rooms with their flashlights and headlamps. The hut was eerily dark with the windows still boarded up from the harsh winter. Someone heard a noise, a whimper, coming from below the kitchen sink. At last, George was found, shaking horribly and crouched under the sink with the cabinet doors closed. In his white fists, he clutched an axe and pleaded with his crewmates, "Just please, get me the hell out of here. Just get me out of here." Stunned by this discovery, the crew members quickly pulled him out of the cupboard. He was soaked in sweat and trembling in fear. The members begged George to tell them what was wrong, yet he would not answer them. He simply repeated, "Just get me the hell out of here, please." Quietly, they surrounded their friend in a secure clutch and helped him outside the hut and back onto the trail down the mountain. One crew member radioed back to the Pinkham Notch base for assistance, and an ambulance was waiting for them as soon as they reached the bottom. What terror had taken form at the hut to reduce the bravest of men into this state of unprecedented fear? No one could say. They guessed that he had run into a wild animal, maybe a wolf or bear, and had become fearful for his life. As the weeks passed and George lay recovering in the hospital, he finally opened up to a close confidant and relayed this story. After his long trek up the trail, he was overcome with exhaustion and hunger. He unlocked the heavy padlocks on the hut doors and quickly went inside into the large dining hall. There he sat on the bench by one of the tables and began to take account of his food supplies as he rested. He thought he'd wait just a short while and catch his breath before radioing back to the base. Suddenly, he felt as if there were someone else in the dining room with him. He felt a form approach him from behind, as if someone was about to put their hands on his shoulders. He jumped up and quickly turned around to face the back of the dining hall. There, peering in at him from the dining room window, was a face. A distorted, grotesque face pressed to the glass of the dining room window panes, which were entirely boarded up from the outside. George backed up in horror as he looked at each window pane covered by the thick boards, and there he saw, one after the other, the same face. in every window, glaring back at him. The face seemed to melt through the glass and into the room where he was standing. That was the last thing George remembered. He would never return to the hut or the AMC crew again, and has since lost all memory of the trauma of the summit that changed his life forever. Story 29. 7 or 8 years ago, during a stretch of hot, dry days in August, I attended a bluegrass festival at Thomas Point Beach in Brunswick, Maine. The headliner of the festival that year was Ralph Stanley, who had been on the bluegrass scene since the late 40s, but had been recently cast into the national spotlight because his song "Oh Death" had been included in the "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou" soundtrack. On the day of Ralph Stanley's performance, I was at the front left of the stage. Ralph was dressed in black from his boots to his cowboy hat, and I remember thinking he must have been sweltering in the heat. It was a typical but talented performance. But after 3 songs, the rest of the band stopped playing, and Ralph grabbed his mic and stepped forward a few paces. After a few moments, he started singing his new big hit, "Oh Death," in his old quavery voice. After just a couple lines, I noticed several of the people standing around me were turning away from the stage. When I turned my head to see what was happening, I realized I was standing at the edge of a cleared space within the crowd, at the center of which was a heavy-set woman, splayed on her back with someone kneeling next to her, giving her CPR. Ralph Stanley is extremely old, and I imagine that he couldn't see what was happening, even though it was no more than 30 feet away from the stage. So he just continued to sing, "You run my life right out of my soul. Oh, death, please consider my age. Please don't take me at this stage." I remember a woman standing beside me, a stranger, touched my arm and, without taking her eyes away from the woman on the ground, said, "Do you hear this song? Is this happening right now?" By the time the song had ended, the man had stopped giving the woman CPR. She was gone. We learned later it was a heart attack. The crowd was stunned and totally silent, and in the silence you could hear the sound of an ambulance siren growing in the distance. Later that night, my friend struck up a conversation with the fiddle player from Ralph Stanley's band after getting an autograph. He invited him to come jam with the band in their bus. During a whiskey break between jams, my friend asked the band members something along the lines of, "So that was pretty traumatic out there today, huh?" The fiddle player laughed and said, "Shit, that's happened like 4 times," and took a shot of whiskey. Story 30. My dad told me this one, and so a few details might be hazy, but it's not important. He was working out in Saudi Arabia and used to sail a lot in the Gulf with his friend on something called a Hobie 16. Is that a thing? I don't know, boats. One day after a really long day sailing up and down the coast, they are exhausted, and the wind is so strong, they are able to sail the boat right up onto the sand at the end. When they get onto shore, there's a family of Pakistanis looking distressed, and one of them comes over and asks my dad if they'd seen a windsurfer out on the water because someone was missing. My dad had been up and down the stretch of coast all day and had seen no one surfing, so he's reluctant to go back onto the water. Remember, he and his mate are both exhausted, but the guy tells him all about the windsurfer, gives him a description, white guy, etc. And just for safety's sake, my dad agrees to go back out. So they go out and sail up and down and see nothing, and the sun is beginning to go down, so they're thinking the people on the shore were mistaken or something, when suddenly my dad sees a small silhouette on the water. Unable to stop the boat because of the wind, they have to make a close pass to the object to see what it is. It turns out to be a small Pakistani boy clinging to a box. My dad scoops him up as they go past, and the boy wordlessly huddles into a ball in the middle of the boat. Furious, my dad sails the boat back to the family and up the beach again, and the boy jumps off to greet his mom and dad. And my dad demands to know why they lied about it being a white man surfing. The guy tells my dad that they didn't think he'd go out and look if he'd known it was a Pakistani missing. Apparently, the boy had been playing with the box by the shore and then floated out a bit. No one could swim to go get him.